Let's start with the Tennessee Titans as the first team we are going to cover. As I said, Dan Pizzuta wrote the Tennessee Titans chapter. Tom Gower is our resident Titans expert. So we have the Titans making the playoffs 37% of the time, roughly. They're projected as the 19th best team. Dan, you wrote the chapter. Tell me a little bit about the sort of thrust of what you wrote about the Tennessee Titans in Football Outsiders Almanac 2022.
It was real interesting because I feel like the Titans, we kind of talked about it all year last year, that the Titans probably weren't as good of a team as, they seemed, at least record-wise, especially when you look at what they were, the 1 seed in the AFC. And it kind of seems like they sat back a little bit and went, yeah, we probably weren't as good as that record said we were. And in a year where all of the AFC teams decided they were going to go all in and push to contend in either, 2022 and beyond, the Titans kind of said, maybe let's pull back a little bit. We're still going to try to win. We still have a pretty veteran roster. We have some young guys who are developing, but let's also give us some pivot points. Let's not extend or restructure Ryan Tannehill again to push more money into the future. Let's not extend or restructure Derrick Henry to push more of that money into the future. Let's trade AJ Brown, get a rookie deal, wide receiver in there. So they gave themselves a lot of points where they can, if they're not as good as maybe they might think, or if the AFC South is a little closer, they have some room to kind of move to the future as early as 2023. So 2022 kind of seems like a wait and see kind of year for them.
Yeah, which is weird for a team coming off the number 1 seed. But like you said, they were the worst ever number 1 seed by DVOA. I believe they were the worst ever number 1 or number 2 seed ever by DVOA. Right. So they were not as good as their win-loss record. On the other hand, this division is not strong. It's still there for the taking. They're still very much in it. Our numbers may have them, with like a 50% chance of making the playoffs. We have them very close with the Colts, and surprisingly, you're going to learn the Houston Texans. But, they're still very much in this to make the playoffs in 2022.
Looking at it from a sort of like a team building perspective, it's an interesting strategy because General Manager John Robinson has always focused on maximizing the current season. And yet last year with the Julio Jones trade and the cap restructures was really the first time he'd sacrificed future assets. And now he's sort of like sacrificing present assets, except maybe I think part of the motivation behind the AJ Brown trade was they were worried about how productive Brown would be this season in particular if they didn't pay him the money. So this is sort of like, it feels to me almost more like contingent planning as opposed to a design of not trying to maximize this year's team. So I sort of have a different, more local perspective on it, but it's sort of like, and the division is still weak and they figure like we'll be as good as we can be this season. I think they still really believe in themselves as a team and their defined style. One of the things you wrote about in the chapter, Dan, is even after Derrick Henry went hurt, they still ran the ball just as much, even though they weren't as effective at it. This is a team that believes very strongly in their identity and they're very committed to it. And they think it gives them something that our numbers aren't capturing, which is why they got the number 1 seed last year, just notwithstanding all the things we said about them.
Right. And I think that's part of it, where this is still a good roster, but they didn't want to pull like a New Orleans Saints, right? Where they're going to really trap themselves into this roster and push everything down that they, potentially could have. So they still have the roster that they have and they like it, but they're able to kind of spread some things for the future. Like I talked about, the Malik Willis, you're not banking on a 3rd round pick to become your next, quarterback of the future, but they have that option now, which is something they didn't really give themselves last year.
I think there's a big difference here between the offense and the defense. We have the defense projected much better than the offense. The defense really improved last year, and we don't have them kind of giving back those improvements because there's a lot of good young players on the defense. It's the offense where I think a lot of the question marks are.
Yeah, and I think the biggest surprise, we had them, as Titans fans will like to remind you, projected as the worst defense in the league last year. They were 32nd in our projections in last year's Almanac. And I think part of that was, I'd characterize it as they were really likely to be bad, as opposed to we thought they'd be really bad, because that projection was still better than they had been in 2020. But I think what really surprised me the most last year was about how the defensive coaching was much better than we expected, and a more backward-looking version of the Almanac. I think that's something really worth highlighting about. You mentioned this a little bit in the Elijah Molden write-up, where he really improved from week 6, but they started out with him as a slot corner. He got burned vertically for touchdowns in both week 1 and week 2, and then they basically benched him for a couple weeks, and they basically completely changed how they played defense when they came back. And that was a sort of flexibility that we hadn't seen from them in previous seasons, where 2020 in particular, where they had the worst third down conversion rate of any team in the last 30 years, and they basically decided, we'll just play the same way pretty much all season, minus some minor game-to-game tweaking. And I think that sort of adaptability they showed last year is the key to that 9th overall defensive projection, even notwithstanding maybe a full healthy season of Bud Dupree, now that he's no longer coming off a torn ACL, and with Jeffrey Simmons making the leap as a pass rusher last season. That was one of the things that you highlighted in the chapter, Dan, and I think that's really was ESPN just did their rankings, and Simmons was the second best interior defensive lineman in the league behind Aaron Donald. And he was still a really good player in 2020, but that jump as a pass rusher is the thing that we're waiting to see from him, and that we thought he had the potential to do, but we've seen a bunch of players who have the potential to do things like that never actually make that leap.
Yeah, that's where the youth is on this team too. So that's where I think we're kind of expecting them to develop. When you look on the offensive side of the ball, it's a fairly old Ryan Tannehill. It's a fairly old for a running back and coming off an injury, Derrick Henry. So that's where they're getting older. On the defensive side of the ball, that's where a lot of their youth and promise is. Kevin Byard's like the veteran there, but he's been one of the better safeties in the league. You add Amani Hooker next to him. Christian Fulton had a really nice season. I know some of the the playoff kind of sticks with the recency bias in our head, where it wasn't the greatest matchup, but he had a really good season. So like that's where we continue, and I think can see it develop. And like you said, some of the pivot points they had just in the season, they kind of, with Mike Vrabel, were very, single high and, stacked box heavy when he was running the defense. And now this past season, they ran a lot of too high. They had light boxes a lot more often than you would think. They were top 5 in the rate of light boxes. I think it helps when you have, Zach Cunningham, you can play the run. I mean, that's pretty much all he does at this point. But I think like that adaptability and the youth, and they can move some pieces around. That's where the defense is really the bright spot.
Talking about the Titans on offense, to me, I think a big question here is what Ryan Tannehill is going to be. Tannehill was terrible in our numbers last year. Now, I realize our numbers have him much worse than other numbers. The main reason for that is the differentiation between pass and run, because he was very good running the ball, and in fact has been really good, efficient running the ball the last few years. But passing, he was something like 27th in DVOA. And of course, the explanation for that is, well, look at all the games that he didn't have A.J. Brown and Julio Jones, except that this year, that's all the games.
Right. Yeah. I think the Titans kind of had that. They had the right idea, because when Julio Jones and A.J. Brown were on the field together, that offense was pretty good. But it wasn't a lot of snaps. And it's like you said, it's going to be 0 this year. I think the one thing that stood out for me on Tannehill was that he's always been someone who's really been impacted by pressure. And he was one of the worst quarterbacks by DVOA under pressure this year. His gap last year was even bigger between pressure and not pressure. But the concerning thing is his DVOA without pressure has gone down in each of the past 3 seasons. So if he has that big of a gap with pressure and not pressured, and the unpressured performance isn't as high as it once was, that's kind of concerning of where you're going to be going, like this type of quarterback who needs to be, schemed up. He's one of those guys who can do really well off play action. That's kind of what the entire offense was built off of, the in-breakers off play action. So if that's not going to be as good in the ideal circumstances, then you kind of have to worry, especially with an offensive line that we don't really know how good it's going to be coming into the year.
And you mentioned how old the offense was, and it's basically you go you look almost everywhere. They're trying, last season in particular, everybody other than Julio Jones and right guard Nate Davis is older for the position. I think they're slowly changing the players from the 2019 to 21 peak to whatever the next era of the Titans is going to be. Feels like a maintenance year almost, but they're still the best team in the division. Now, what I would wonder is if you're the Colts or the Titans as a team and you see our projections have the AFC South as tighter than, I would say, conventional wisdom probably has it, does this affect your thinking at all?
Well, no, because you've got the players you've got now. So you're going into the season trying to win this division. And we're saying that the division is there for any team to take. So it's not like the Titans and the Colts are going to not try to win it. We say the Titans and the Colts still have a strong chance to win it. I think if you had seen our projections 3 or 4 months ago, maybe it changes what you do. But then that sort of goes with what Dan is saying. Like, if you saw our projections where we didn't have the Titans way ahead of everybody else, what you would do is what the Titans actually did, which is trade A.J. Brown and get a rookie wide receiver instead.
Yeah, and that's one of those things. Like they could have continued to push Tannehill's money, into the future. They could have, worked a way to, Derrick Henry has a $15 million cap hit this year. They could have found a way to lower that, push more money into the future, and maybe, get another piece or so. But when you look at kind of the grand scheme of what it is, and you're, still competing in the, the AFC with, the Chiefs, the Chargers, all of those other teams, is like one other piece worth for the Titans pushing a lot of that money into 2023 when like maybe you're gonna be okay in the divisional round? Like, are they really going to, were they another piece away for 2022 to really compete with some of the other top teams in the AFC? I'm not sure they were. And I think that's kind of the calculus that they had, where they're still going to be good. They could still easily win the division. But whether it's, truly a contender and whether that was worth sacrificing some of the flexibility they now have for 2023, I don't think they wanted to do that.
What's your feeling about Treylon Burks and the asthma business? Because the guy hasn't been able to get on the field.
Mike Vrabel is very New England, very cagey about injury issues and player health and future availability. I'm basically in wait and see mode until training camp. And I think it's going to be, I won't feel really confident one way or the other about how it's going to go until we actually get actual NFL games played. So that's sort of like a question I'm going to try to keep updating my thought on through like the end of September, which is not ideal from a projection standpoint, but it feels like he has a very wide range of outcomes. And the receiving core is basically him, Robert Woods coming off a torn ACL, and then it's Nick Westbrook-Ikhine, who's a wide receiver for special teams guy, 5th round rookie Kyle Phillips. I thought last year after A.J. Brown and Julio Jones was really thin, this is like even thinner than that. And the offense is basically like, if everything goes right, they'll be average or a little above.